Right. Good morning, everybody. Well, good afternoon, actually, technically. Um, Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to kick off now. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Leslie Stevenson, and I'm the publisher of Governance, the monthly journal about all things good governance worldwide. And delighted to be doing another webinar with our friends at the Board Effectiveness Guild, Alex, Ian, and Chris, looking at all things to do with board reviews, when you should have them, how you should have them. And I hope that you've all got plenty of questions for them. They're going to have just a sort of a chat um, amongst themselves. And the event is going to be recorded, so you can watch it afterwards or pass it on to any colleagues who haven't been able to make it. We will send a recording out. That'll probably be about the end of the week. Um, any questions, please can you put them in the Q&A, because then we can see them, and also Zoom then records them, which is great for our records. So I think we're going to kick off now, and I'm going to sort of ask Ian to sort of start and look at when is the best time to have a board review, Ian?
So thank you, Leslie, and welcome everyone. I suppose this question really comes up when obviously something is going on either with the company or the board, because if we look at the traditional cycle of doing board reviews, it's normally a 3-year cycle for many companies and organisations. So years one and two are internal reviews, and year three will be the external review. So if things are going business as usual, then that's probably the pattern you're going to fit into. Um, where it gets a bit different or a bit challenging is if something material is happening in the organization. So a very relevant example will be if there's going to be a change of a major player around the boardroom table, and typically that will be the chair or the CEO. So, for example, if you've got a new chair has just joined, particularly if they've come from outside and haven't been an internal appointment, then you might think it's a good time actually to defer the doing the review until they've had a year or so to get their feet under the table and really understand the board. But there's a counter argument to that in that, it's quite useful for a new chair to have a copy of the external board review in particular when they're coming in. Certainly, I've had experiences of doing reviews and new chair coming in straight after the review and then having a session with the new chair to talk through some of the things. So it can be quite a useful roadmap. As I say, the counter to that is that you might think it's better to let things settle down. I think some companies get quite concerned about this, or some boards, and particularly an understanding in the regulated sector where your regulators are expecting you to, in particular with external review, to do it on a regular basis. But I do think it's, obviously something you would raise with your regulator. I do think people are sympathetic, shareholders, other stakeholders, if you've got a good reason and you justify that. And I've certainly seen that in the report and accounts, a statement saying we've decided to defer for this reason. For example, there might have been a merger, and that's why we're not going ahead with the review.
Ian, I've seen that. I've seen that kind of exactly that, where the board was asking for a board review, but didn't really want to have one at this point because there was the likelihood of a major transaction
Mm,
happening,
yeah,
and but they felt rather compelled to follow the rules, if you
mm,
like. And actually,
mm.
what we did in that case was we convinced them to actually write, something into their report and accounts that actually said this is the reason why we're deferring it, because it was absolutely the wrong time for them to have it.
Yeah, no, that was the example I was about to give, Alex, was actually that, I've certainly done reviews where a takeover has happened, for example, and
Yeah,
the, and the, and
yeah.
the, and the company has explained in the report and accounts why they've deferred to do that. Um, but there are other reasons you might want to defer again, if you're going through the acquisition process. Obviously, not a not necessarily a great time to do a review. Equally, though, for an acquirer, they may think, well, actually, we want to acquire X PLC or X company, and we'd like a review done before we go through the process. So I think there are all sorts of reasons why you might do that. I think you can actually put this the other way around there as well. Is when is it definitely not a good time to do a review? And I've had a couple of experiences where I've started the review process off, everything's been going well with the organisation, but then there's been some crisis, and I've continued on both occasions with the actual board review. But I could tell that the board, it was the last thing the board wanted actually to do. And I wonder in those sort of circumstances, even obviously frustrating for the board review, the sensible course of action is to say, look, we need to put this on hold till next year. We've got actually more important things to focus on.
Yeah, I think that's true. I'm just thinking of a board review just now that where we got halfway through and again, a major distraction for the board and was going to happen at the actual observation of the board. And what we did was we pushed everything back by one cycle, which meant the board review lasted a long time. And it had a downside because of that, but the upside was that they would never have paid attention, at the time that was originally planned. So I think it's good to be able to kind of respond, isn't it?
Yeah.
To whatever's happening.
I think the challenges of sort of timetable vis-a-vis sort of expected external reviews are actually becoming an increasing phenomenon within board reviews, because I think if you look at the fact that you're expected to have a review every 3 years, the average life or the average tenure of a CEO, I think, is sort of 4 or 5 years. The average tenure of a chair may be, 6 plus or minus. So it is not surprising that this issue of we have a major event coming through, should we defer the board review or bring it forward, we should expect it to be an increasing phenomena, and therefore having that adaptability in the way you approach the sort of 3 year cycle, I think is almost a necessity now rather than a sort of almost an unusual event. And I would reiterate what you've said, Alex, in terms of I've never known shareholders object to any explanation that a company has given for not doing the board review within the time cycle, the strict time cycle. Indeed, I think shareholders, are pretty accepting that if you've got a good reason for doing things in a slightly different order, then absolutely no problem at all. I think it's just having that good reason or that good explanation that's the key.
Yeah. I think you could almost look at the situation the other way around, couldn't you? Have either of you seen situations where a board should be doing its board review and is delaying it for other reasons? So, for example, there is some interpersonal problem or challenge on the board, and they're finding every way to sort of, in a sense, avoid the problem by knowing that it would come out in the board review. I don't know if either of you seen that?
I've not seen it for those reasons. I have had experiences where the company's left it so late to undertake the review that I remember one they wanted for a December year end, and I got rung up at the beginning of December, said, would you be able to do our board review? And so I certainly seen companies have had to defer for that reasons because they haven't planned sufficiently well. I've not got any direct experience of a company doing it for the rather more devious reasons that you suggest, Alex, but I'm sure that may be the case on occasion.
Yeah.
I think I've seen situations where it's a genuine concern rather than a sort of a reason to push things back. Generally, I think boards are pretty honest about these things. But I certainly had a situation last year where I was sort of going through the process of taking on a board review, and the company secretary sort of mentioned 2 or 3 times in the conversations that there was this sort of particular issue I never quite got to the bottom of exactly what it was, but it was clearly quite a profound concern that was weighing on their mind in terms of the review. And in the end, they turned around and said, "Look, we can't do this now. We've got to sort this out." And I kind of thought that, you're absolutely right. Sounds like you've got to get that sorted. I think my only counterpoint to that sort of discussion would be, well, is there any way in which a review could be part of the solution finding here? Because,
Yeah.
as an independent external observer of the board, you may actually be able to contribute some insights that would not otherwise be available to those who are obviously more directly impacted by whatever it is. So I certainly think that's always an option to suggest if the view is, well, we should push this back, and say, well, actually, why don't you make it part of the solution finding? Appreciate that may not be a good way forward for all sorts of different reasons, but I think it illustrates a way in which you can think of the board review not as just something we have to do irrespective of what's going on, but something that could be built into the sort of evolution of a board's life anyway.
Yeah, it's this idea of it being a developmental activity rather than just an audit.
I think I mentioned about the regulator. I do think boards need to make sure if they're in a regulated sector, I'm thinking obviously financial services or utilities, that you do clear it with your regulator. And I certainly came across one organisation I did the review for where they weren't listed, but they were regulated by the financial services regulators, where they decided that they were going to defer, and they got a quick statement from the regulator saying, no, we're not happy for that. So I think if you are going to defer and you are regulated, you've got to be conscious about making sure that you've got buy-in from that.
Definitely.
Leslie, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. What about the sort of the type of review? If you've got people who are pushing back, do you ever get people asking for a light touch review? And if so, what is that, and what does it look like? Chris, do you want to start on that?
Yes, I do. Do you ever get asked? Yes, all the time. And I have to confess, it's a very annoying question to be asked, if I'm honest. Because I kind of think, well, what do you mean by light touch? And what does that say about your attitude to this part of the governance process? My pushback would be, say, have you ever asked your auditors for a light touch audit, or have you ever asked your board members for a light touch board paper? So why are you asking for a light touch board review? I think when I reflect on it, there's probably three reasons why I think boards do ask for a light touch review. If what they mean is, can we do it a little bit simpler, or can we do it a bit more time efficiently, or something like that. The first one is time. They may be time pressed because of transaction or for other reasons. And I would say my answer to that would be, well, if time is the issue, then think about actually when you want to hold it and whether there would be a better time, much in the way that we've discussed it already. Don't be driven to do something that's suboptimal just because you're going to do it now because of a regulation. I think the second issue may be because of cost, and particularly if you get into the smaller companies, then cost obviously is more important. And I think we all appreciate that P&Ls are under pressure, particularly at the moment. But my view would be, let's think about what's the most effective review we can do within the budget, not let's anticipate the budget and say we want a light touch review. So maybe the question should be, here's my budget, what is the most effective review that you can do for that budget? And that would be a question I would be certainly happy to engage with. I think the most worrying reason why people might ask you to do a light touch review is actually complacency. And I guess my answer to that is, well, pretty much the main driver for the evolution of the UK Corporate Governance Code over the year has been corporate failings, which among other things, but largely have been the result of complacent boards. And even though a board may feel that it's doing a good job now, that doesn't necessarily say that it's well placed for the future. And actually, complacent boards are the least likely to anticipate future risks and future opportunities and so on. So, plea from us as board reviewers: please don't ask us to do a light touch review. Can we have a more sensible question if you've got the problems of time or attitude or cost?
It's kind of like that earlier point, though, isn't it, Chris? That is a board review simply an audit of, kind of what's happening now, or is it actually a developmental activity which actually ensures that the board is fit for the strategic future of the business? And if you're, what we've found is, in some situations where they start going, oh well, I just want a light touch, in conversation with the chair or the company secretary or whoever, the attitudes and change when you start to build that argument that there is additional value to be had from this activity rather than just a tick in the box.
Yeah, I mean, I like you, Chris. I sort of not a fan when I'm asked about doing a light touch review, and I haven't ever said it to a potential client, but would you hire a light touch non-executive director? And I hope the answer to that would be no if I ever asked that question.
You never know.
I think one of the challenges, it's quite difficult to do a light touch review. I mean, you can take components out, so you could say, oh well, we won't do questionnaires. I don't think you can really take the interviews out. I think they're so critical to doing it for the external review. I think they're so critical. So yes, you're absolutely right. You can think, can we tailor for the particular budget? But I think to do board reviews is, I guess I'm bound to say this, and it is, to do them properly. I don't think there's much difference between doing what people term a light touch review and doing a full review, unless, as you say, you have different components. I think where you might have, in a light touch is the wrong word, but you might have a more focused review. So maybe not your regular board review if there's something that the board wants to look at. I mean, a prime example maybe if there are difficulties between board members and you're coming in to review that, or there's maybe a specific project, so maybe an acquisition. Would you perhaps look at how if the board has grown because the acquired company has put some directors on the board, how that group has mixed since the acquisition. So I think you can do something like that. It's not a light touch. It's more of a specific, not a full review, but a specific review on a particular aspect of the board or the company. So I think that's a better way to ask it, I think, rather than using the word light touch.
Leslie?
I'll get it right one day. So we've got a question in the chat here, Alex, and I know that you are going to look at, when you are doing a review, what do you do about new board members or people who just recently retired? And someone has asked, how long should the board review take place after a change in the majority of NEDs? So if you have a massive change rather than just one individual one, and then if you could go on to think about the individual persons as well.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think of a board review as developmental, you can also think of a board review as a piece of positive influence and communication. So if you're thinking of it as a piece of communication, a positive piece of communication, then engaging people in the review process becomes positive. It's rather than keeping it very tight and kind of not allowing other people to input into it. With boards that are changing, certainly my experience is there are two different arguments for when you might, who you might involve. So if a chair is moving on, end of their tenure, etc., this cannot be a board review, and a board review report can be, in a sense, a kind of legacy activity. So it can encapsulate what that person's tenure at the board has resulted in. And therefore that can be input into the induction of the new chair, the new whomever that is coming through. So you can do it that way. The other way around is when a chair is coming into a review, into a board, a new chair, then I've seen them commission a board review quite early on, actually, before any habits are set, which means it comes with a kind of open agenda. So, so in those occasions, kind of when the new chair has perhaps only done 1 or 2 board cycles, and they use that as a collective way of drawing the board together on a kind of set of an agenda of change for that board, which reflects the new leadership. So with individual board members, and you know, how long would you do it? I actually like the gathering first impressions of from new NEDs on boards. So if a new NED has been appointed to the board and it's kind of, you know, right before the board review was commissioned, they maybe have seen the board only once. That can be incredibly refreshing to get their perspective on the operation of the board. So I'm a fan. I'm also a fan of opening engaging with as many people as possible. So that would include executives who are observers of the board, but not board members themselves. It might include stakeholders of the board. It might include the regulator, it might include shareholders, etc. Other parties that, again, by engaging them in the board review and inviting their comment, what you're doing is you're sending a message that says this is a board that is self-critical, that is wanting to improve, and is wanting to engage people in that process. But I don't know what other people's experience might have been with bringing people in. Chris, do you have a view?
Sorry, you mean in terms of bringing other people into the review?
Yeah, you know, who you might have sort of
Yeah.
interviewed, kind of beyond just the straightforward, you know, these are the board members.
Yeah, I mean, I think we probably all agree that the more people you can engage within reason, of course, the better. And I sometimes when I'm doing a review, I talk about the stakeholders of the board being particularly the executives that were, you know, some boards have some of their senior executive team attending every single board meeting for pretty much the whole meeting, apart from maybe 1 or 2 sensitive points. Others are a bit more of a closed shop in that regard. But if you've got executives who are looking to the board for, you know, decision making and to, you know, opine on papers that they've presented or whatever, I think it's only fair sometimes to actually talk to them and say, well, how do you find the board in terms of the lead that it gives you and the direction it provides? So you know, I definitely think that's an option. Perhaps just go back to your point, Alex, about, you know, changes as a chair. I think one of the points that is almost a fact of life these days is it's very rare that you kind of have one change and then a sort of period of kind of calm, if I can call it that, before any other change. And in fact, I feel increasingly that particularly with the sort of rotation policies and that we see in listed companies for sure. It is actually, you know, it's very rare that you have too much of a period of sort of steadiness between a chair changing, a CEO changing, a SID changing, which actually is quite a significant change. Possibly even your key committee chairs. I'm thinking particularly of audit and risk and
Completely.
possibly REM as well. And certainly I've had examples of companies where they really looked at that sort of, what are the changes coming up over the next 3 years, 5 years, whatever it is. Oh, we've got the chair, and then we're going to do the chair, and then we'll change the SID, or we might do the chair and then the CEO.
Yeah.
And with the CEO, you've always got CEO, and then look at strategy, maybe
Yeah.
an update on strategy, etc., etc. So I think you've got to accept that change is a constant in terms of the key personnel on the board, and I think that then makes it necessary to be sort of strategic in how you look at the timing of your board review, have good reasons for deferring or bringing forward, as we've already discussed. But I don't think it makes it easy just to sort of say, well, we're going to stick to the time cycle that we've got to stick to, come what may, and just try and manage around the issues. I think, as we've said already, it's all about thinking how best to use the review process um, within that whole cycle. And perhaps on that point, I can pick up on the one question, picking up on my earlier comment about the external advisory role. I think what I was saying was not so much I see the external reviewer as an advisor to the board, particularly in relation to some sort of corporate transaction, but more if you've got this independent person sort of looking at what you're doing, looking at how you do things, it may be that perspective can be a useful one to help the board in whatever decision making that it's having to deal with at that time, and using the board review as an input, but recognizing that the reviewer is going to be an independent, have perhaps less less intimate knowledge of the company, but actually what comes with that is more distance, which can be a useful perspective.
Can I just come back on who to interview, in particular the question that does come up about new directors, and actually interestingly people who've departed. I mean, I think that the great advantage of interviewing new NEDs, hopefully they've attended at least one board meeting, but they'll bring a perspective normally from other boards they sit on, and that can be really helpful.
Definitely.
And they at that stage they're generally completely objective. They've got no baggage around the boardroom table. So I think there's a real value in interviewing those people. Equally, I think it's worth considering interviewing people who've left the board. But I have had a couple of experiences where I've suggested doing that, and people have left under a cloud, and I'm sort of told, well, you might not get a very objective view, and indeed they may not want to be interviewed. So, but again, I think that they can provide a very candid view. So I think it's definitely
I think
worth looking at those people. The other people, I think, I mean, we talked about whether you should be interviewing executives, and I think it's obviously the code suggests that you do that, or the UK Corporate Governance Code suggests you do that. But I think it's useful to do that if they are regular attendees. But I think also interviewing other people throughout the organisation can provide a different perspective. So I often try to interview people who don't regularly come to the board, and just very mini interviews, not detailed interviews, but just to see what their view of the board is, how visible the non-executives are, what do they think the board is there for. And I think that's quite useful, particularly when you're interviewing NEDs and you ask them about visibility, and often they'll say, well, very visible, and then you get a different reaction from employees. I think that can be quite very useful feedback in the review report.
Yeah, absolutely. I found real value with the kind of recently retired NEDs, interviewing them. Often positively, but they have an ability to be kind of reflective and unconstrained by the responsibilities of continuing to be part of the board. And I've got some rich feedback from the board, from those individuals for sure.
I think it's interesting when over the years come across a book, been involved in a board review where you have got a newly appointed director, and you'll have a conversation perhaps with the chair where they're sort of saying, well, they've only been to one meeting. And I always say, well, actually, initial impressions are very useful,
Completely.
before they kind of got into whatever the culture is of the board.
Yeah.
But I find I'm really surprised at how reluctant directors are after one meeting, perhaps, to offer their opinions. Sometimes I think it's deference, particularly if it's the first time they're on they've been appointed to maybe a PLC board, and so they're a bit sort of finding their feet and not wanting to sort of go be too bold too quickly. But on the basis that if you've been in a board meeting and you've sort of observed what's going on, I would always find that useful, particularly as an initial impression. I can validate that from what other people are saying, but I do find it surprising how reluctant people are to comment before they've really had too many meetings
It's kind of
in that particular board.
it's sort of a measure of the confidence, isn't it, of the new board member. If they're confident, then they'll be prepared to comment. And if they're maybe a little bit reticent, or as you say, maybe new to the role, they might be a bit more careful in what they say. But I think the interview can get round most of that, though. And kind of, ensuring there's confidentiality in the conversation around the conversation, so that they're not exposing themselves too much. But I think their perspective is really useful.
We've got a couple of questions talking about annual reviews. You mentioned the 3-year cycle, Chris, and a couple of people sort of put in the chat where they have a rotation cycle of their directors. So you've got new directors coming on board every year. Should they be reviewing those individual directors, or should they be doing annual board reviews? What's all your views on that?
Well,
Shall I kick off
okay.
on that? I mean, I think one of the questions you've got on board reviews, certainly if you're following the UK Corporate Governance Code, is where do you build individual assessment into the review? Because the code requires a sort of board review. It also talks about committee reviews, and then it talks about individual reviews. So there should be an element of individual assessment within a review anyway. Sometimes I think people see that as a kind of almost like a performance review, in the same way that you would have a performance review as part of your sort of people management systems. I actually prefer to be more looking at individuals' contributions as a collective, and almost looking to see if anyone's not contributing, rather than sort of get too focused on what individuals are contributing. And so I think but the point is, though, that you need to be thinking about individual assessments somewhere within the process, irrespective of how long a director has been on the board, or a trustee, or whatever it is. So I think that that there's that element. The other element is, of course, we're talking about 3-year external reviews, but the expectation usually is that there is an annual review. It's just that for most companies, that annual review is undertaken usually by the company secretary, or it's done as a let's call it an internal review, which quite often is questionnaire based rather than interview based, which is certainly what we would all use for an external review. So I think the sort of overall requirement is there, and I think it goes back to the same point that we've been making all along, really, which is that it's about thinking strategically, or thinking proactively about how you approach the reviews over certainly a 3-year period, and maybe even a longer period, so that you get that balance of external that has a specific goal and purpose to it, that hopefully links in with where the board is and what it's doing. But then the other elements of the review can be much more sort of, internal, limited to one methodology, particularly questionnaires, can be run internally, which can then be a bit more easier to manage from a board process point of view. So I don't sort of see it as necessarily a conflict there, but hopefully that's sort of a helpful explanation.
I think one thing's, I agree, you've got the cycle. So if you do the cycle properly and you're doing internal years 1 and 2, you should hopefully pick up the assessment anyway, with people joining and leaving the board. I've always been slightly concerned about what the UK Corporate Governance Code says about it, its guidance on individual assessments, because I think that really is the main role of the chair, to do those individual assessments. And certainly when I do reviews, I don't sort of say, what do you think about Chris Stamp, Alex, or something like that, because I think that's very divisive. And I've certainly been, when I've pitched to do reviews, I've been asked to do that, and I've always responded that way, saying, actually, I think that will be that won't help you at all. So if the
I
chair is
agree.
doing their role effectively, they should be doing those assessments.
Yeah, I agree, and I've taken much the same approach, really. What we do is we offer individual feedback at the end of the review. If a board member is thinking, how would I respond to what's come out in the review and what's in the report? How would I respond individually? Then we offer that conversation with them, which, by that time you've got enough knowledge to be able to give some feedback and things. But it's not about dividing and conquering between individual relationships, really, there.
Thank you. So just to clarify, Alex, when you do that, that would be one-on-one. That would be the reviewer just feeding back to the individual director about their own behaviour, not generally to the board.
No, not generally to the board, and confidentially,
Yeah.
and not reported back to anyone.
Perfect. You mentioned, Chris, that if in internal reviews, quite often the company secretary is the person who organises that. And we've had a question from Tom saying, and this is addressed to all of you, do you find that company secretaries give candid and comprehensive views?
Depends on the company secretary.
Tom, thanks very much for that question. I think that company secretaries really struggle with doing board reviews because not because they don't have good views on their boards. Quite often they do, and actually interviewing a company secretary as part of a board review is as fruitful as a source as Alex's sort of Ned who's just left the board, I find. But I think, if you think of the sort of skill sets that are involved in a board review, particularly if you're running a questionnaire, if you think of how much time and effort goes into producing a marketing questionnaire, it's not a dissimilar skill set to what you need to produce a good board questionnaire. And although there are packages out there that will provide you with the resources, and actually that they're the resources that company secretaries use, I don't think that the sort of practice of company secretaries in really using those tools to optimum effect is good, but I don't think it's part of their sort of natural skill set either. The good company secretaries will be doing the sort of things that they're expected to do under the board, under the UK Corporate Governance Code, which is, being an advisor to the chair, saying the sort of things that they think the chair should be hearing, not necessarily not necessarily the things the chair wants to hear, but a good company secretary will have that sort of emotion and intelligence to be able to do that, and indeed work with all of the board colleagues. They don't need to be providing candid reviews through the board, an internal board review process. I think it's an area where, the company secretarial profession could do more to equip company secretaries to be able to handle internal reviews better. So I guess that answers your question, Tom.
I mean, I think it's really difficult for the company secretary to give candid reviews, and it's a bit like, and I'm bound to say this being an external board reviewer, it's a bit like when you see internal reviews, and the directors mark themselves. It's rare to see directors mark themselves, 1 out of 5. It tends to be 4.5 out of 5. I remember doing one review where it was a review that was asked to be done by the PRA for a company, and they were concerned about the quality of the directors, and the weakest director on the board marked herself as being more financially proficient than the CFO. So I guess the point I'm trying to make, I think from the COSEC's perspective, it is quite difficult to provide it. Certainly, I mean, they can do a comprehensive review, but being candid. I remember another review I did where I had my feedback with the particular chair, who was quite very challenging and very good, a very effective chair. And he said to me, "I can't believe anybody would have said this particular comment, Ian." And I said, "Well," and I could tell he was trying to find out who said it. Of course, clearly I had to keep the confidence. And he said, "Well, I'll ask the company secretary about what she thinks." And I thought, well, that'll be an interesting conversation because she's the person who made the point. And she was brave enough to actually say to the chair, actually, it was me, and he accepted that. But I do think you're in a really difficult position as a company secretary sometimes to be candid. You're employed by the organisation normally, and that doesn't give you the independence. I think Chris is right. It's perhaps an area we could people can always improve in this area, but I think it is very difficult to certainly to give candid feedback sometimes if you're the internal COSEC.
I think it also depends how the company secretary role is configured and perceived by the board, and particularly how the chair wants the company secretary to operate. So, you see company secretarial roles which are more administrative, and others that are much more advisory in nature. And I think, as reviewers, we have to be, kind of quick to understand how it works here, and respond accordingly. But and in those different roles, that can influence the type of feedback and the quantity and the candor with which they actually give their input into the review itself. But they're essential voice, absolutely.
And we've had another question. You mentioned earlier on the regulator, Ian. So Shivers asked, he says, in the world of highly regulated financial boards, especially subsidiary boards, where the diktat of the regulator takes precedence over that of corporate governance across a number of factors, do you have any views or experience in making sure that when you're doing reviews, the board understands they also have to ensure they are compliant with the law and regulation?
Shall I take that one? I mean,
Yep.
to start with, I mean, we're not there to advise on whether a company is legally or indeed regulatory compliant, and I think it would be very difficult to do that in terms of a board review. One of the challenges with board reviews, as we all know, external board reviews, it's a snapshot in time. So you're only seeing, you're observing the board and committees, and you're interviewing people, but you're not going to see the full picture. You're not going to see all the policies and procedures. You're not going to know whether there is full compliance. I often find this is a question that when charities ask for board reviews to be undertaken, they ask for a sort of compliance and legal check, and you have to say, look, we're not lawyers, and we're not regulatory specialists in the way that whether it's charity regulation or financial services or utilities or whatever it is. So I think you have to be very clear about that we're not actually doing that. It's a different service that we're offering.
You both said, Chris and Alex, you both agree with that?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. For a board review to be effective, it has to know what it's not doing as well as what it's doing. So boundary management is, as in all these sort of activities, has to be absolutely clear. And, kind of as reviewers, we need to be very self-disciplined on that. That's my view.
Mm. I think I don't have a huge amount of experience with regulated businesses, but my sense from the ones that I have done is um, there always does seem to be an ongoing conversation with the regulator. There's usually someone on the board who has some sort of some sort of ongoing conversation with the chair, maybe the chair or the CEO. So I do feel that even with a regulated business and one that's sort of having to do it to kind of tick that particular box, there is always a context that you can kind of draw on in the review to major on what's the discussion that you're currently having with your regulator, whether it's about, I don't know, succession or some more technical requirements. And I think one of the things that always concerns me about a review is its relevance to the board. And certainly if there's a discussion that's relevant for a director, for a board because of their regulator, then that should be a really good starting point to make it, make it an appropriate review.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. And another very interesting question has just come up. How can we ensure that feedback from effectiveness reviews are appropriately followed through? As in my experience, sometimes effectiveness reviews can be treated like a tick box exercise with little ongoing focus. You're all grinning at that one. Who wants to go first?
Shall I go? I mean, I think a couple of things. I mean, one of the things that the Financial Reporting Council has done in the past is pick up on this very point, is that it's all very well spending lots of time on the review, but then if it's a bit like that detailed contract, you spend ages negotiating and it sits in a drawer and nobody follows it. So I think it is an area of concern, and you need to make sure it's what you want to get something out of the external review. And I always think that clients that go with the approach that it is a tick box exercise are missing something, because the value is to get something positive out of it. So I think that the first thing is to make sure that yes, the review is important, but implementation is more so in many ways. And second, having a really clear action plan. So when I do reviews, and I'm sure Alex and Chris do the same, is you say that this is your external review. You're not going to do it for another 3 years. We're creating an action plan for you to undertake some of the recommendations that you agree with over the next 3 years. And I always add, it doesn't mean you need to do everything straight away. You don't. I have to say, most of the company secretaries I work with do the action plan much better than I do. I think they're really good company secretaries. They're really focused on it, and it's really clear. So I think it's having that, making sure you've got that action plan.
I think it's, from a review point of view, what can you do at the latter stages of the review to encourage, emotionally blackmail in whatever language you want, action to happen as a consequence of it. One of the ways that I've seen it work is that the company secretary, who's often got the job of sort of administering the action plan from the review, they stay in touch with me and kind of use my kind of advice and guidance or whatever to help them push it forward. So again, it's a bit like the individual feedback that we talked about earlier. It's about indicating that action is expected following on. But when all's said and done, the action has to be the board's. It can't be the action of the reviewer. So if it's purely a tick box, then that can reflect. One of the things that we always do is look back at the last review. Okay, so what happened? What did you intend to do? What did you do, and why? And if not, why not? So that can be productive in pointing out to the board that they didn't take action in the previous occasion.
One, I agree with you, Alex. I think at the end of the day, you make your reports, you make your recommendations, and at the end of the day, who knows what the board is going to do. I guess I try and build that engagement into the latter stages of the process. So what I always try and do is when I do interviews is actually interview the chair last. I've usually spoken to him or her a couple of times, obviously in terms of scoping the review and sort of agreeing the approach and so on. But what I tend to do is I'll do the interview that in the same way I've done with every other director, but then I'll also say, right, now I've done that, I'm going to tell you where my thinking is on the recommendations and what sort of things I'm recommending, which I think has two things. One is it kind of helps eliminate those sorts of things that are probably not going to be helpful for whatever reason in the report. So it kind of helps to get that sort of relevance and sort of focus. And secondly, it begins to build buy-in with the chair. If they're sort of saying, yeah, actually, I do agree with that, you've got a bit of a sort of starting point for it being taken forward. I think the second thing is when you're asked to come and present, and what I tend to do in that situation is say, look, I'm not going to talk about what's in the report. I'll take that as read, that you've read it and make sure you've got it in advance so you can read it. What I'll talk about is my recommendations and why I think you should think about this. And that usually then becomes quite a good point of engagement with the whole board. And if they don't like what you said, then you usually find out quite quickly. But if you do begin to get a sense of engagement, and quite often they'll say, yeah, we should do that. And obviously, hopefully it then gets minuted. And then the third area is really just actually picking up with the company secretary afterwards and just saying, look, let's have a chat about, how you're going to take that forward. Are you going to do a board review in 6 months' time of where you are with all the actions and stuff and things like that just helps to build that sort of engagement into the process, albeit at the end of the day you can't guarantee anything on that.
I agree.
So, Ian, I know you've got a particular view on how the process of board reviews should fit in with succession planning. Do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. So, I mean, I think succession is one of the big challenges of boards, and as a German, it is a very overarching point. I often think boards don't focus enough on succession. The nominations committee may only meet once a year. It should meet more often than that, but sometimes it doesn't. And I remember doing a review a couple of years ago where they had a new board in place and talking to the chair said, well, yes, you've got a new board, but you need to obviously keep focused on succession. And he said, well, actually, I think we've got a new board in. I don't think it's the focus we need. And since that time, in the last 2 years, nearly the entire board has changed. So I don't think people should be complacent. The board certainly shouldn't. But I think it's the board review process is obviously very good for getting an independent view on the types of skills that you might want to have in the future. So obviously, when you do the interviews, you'll ask the NED, you'll ask the executives, what skills do you think we're missing? What could we do with given obviously you can't have every skill on the board. Maybe how do we fill skills rather than just doing board appointments? I also think it's good for behaviours as well, looking at the type of behaviours you want on the board, and we often focus over that. We're very concerned with the skills, but not so much with the behaviours. What type of people do we want on the board? Obviously you want independent people, but how the type of people for this particular board culture. So I think it's useful for the chair of the board in particular to get an independent view of skills and behaviours. Really, so it's a great opportunity for that. You're on mute.
Chris and Alex, will you agree with that?
Yeah, I think I agree with Ian. First of all, that succession tends to be underdeveloped on many boards. So it's not something that gets attention paid to it. And I think that board reviews are a key moment for that, to really look ahead and to look at the, synchronizing board appointments and looking at where tenures start and end, and where there are risks, in the current approach adopted by the board. I'm a big fan of succession being a key element. Often it's mentioned in the objectives of the review. We need to kind of plan for the future and things. But back to our earlier point, it's one of the actions that's not necessarily focused on to the same extent. I think using the committee governance process and developing that, sometimes recommending, as Chris was saying, nomination committees that meet more than once a year, that sort of thing can actually bring succession up the agenda and can add some value that way.
I mean, I agree with all of that. I think one of the most interesting questions that I usually ask is, what are the skill sets that the board are going to need in the future?
Completely.
And, these days you hear a lot about AI, and you hear about geopolitical risk, and you hear about stakeholders, all of which is really important stuff. And I think, we are at a point where board composition, even in 3 years' time, is going to be viewed within every company in a different way to how board composition might have been reviewed 3 years ago or 5 years ago. So
Yeah.
it's a really valid question, and I agree. It's one of the areas I would say I make my most commonly make recommendations around.
Me too.
So we've only got like 4 minutes to go, but that brings us nicely on to the last area we wanted to look at. And Chris, I know you have an interest in this. What about AI? Where does it fit in?
Well, I think we're at an interesting time with AI in boardrooms. Obviously, there was a recent articles in the Sunday Times about an EFT, I think, about a particular product that's being used to facilitate sort of boards' evaluation of proposals and so on. And there are elements of where AI is being introduced, particularly in sort of questionnaire-based approaches. I would say in terms of board reviews, the issues are pretty similar for boards and for all sort of stakeholders as they are more generally in the boardroom. You've got issues around confidentiality of information. You've got issues about accuracy, the ability to understand context properly. So I think, it's an evolving piece. That's not to say that AI doesn't have a part to play in efficient reviews, particularly when linked to questionnaires. Whether it's got a role yet in effective reviews where you got real perception and insight, I'm not so sure, but that may be my natural hesitancy about AI rather than, being an accurate picture.
Alex and Ian, do you want to add anything briefly?
Yeah, I'm with Chris here. I think the kind of, as we're learning with AI, the danger is that it can infantilize the user. So I think we have to be very careful beyond the natural efficiency gains that it can offer, piling through large amounts of data, etc. Fantastically useful, fantastically beneficial, potentially. But we're in, boards are a subtle, complex structure of human beings collectively trying to make some decisions, and that's not a purely logical process. With great care would be my comment.
I mean, the only thing I think they're AI can be really useful in reviews for determining the type of questions you might ask in interview.
Of course.
I know now coaches are saying, you know, that they could put into AI and see what sort of questions in coaching they should ask, and they come out with some really good questions. So I think AI is not an area I know much about at all, but certainly that sort of area, I think it can be of benefit, but obviously it's going to increase.
Thank you very much. I remember to turn my microphone on. So we've come to the end of our webinar. I hope you've all found it as fascinating as I have. Thank you so much to Alex, Ian, and Chris for sharing your time and sharing your huge experience. I'm really sorry we didn't get to answer all the questions. And as I said, the recording will be available and will be sent out to you probably at the end of this week. So thanks a lot. Thank you for all your questions, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.